In September 1944, the train carriage, a windowless, juddering iron box, brought its defeated cargo across a strange, soft land. It smelled of coal dust, damp wood, and the stale, anxious exhaustion of men who had just lost everything. Among the 30 German prisoners were 3 distinct figures. Klaus Richter, 37, a former medic, wore the weariness of the veteran in the lines around his eyes. He sought only peace and the survival of the spirit. Erich Müller, barely 20, stood rigid with a furious, brittle ideological pride, seeing every new circumstance as a test of will. And Josef Steiner, who preferred the nickname Sepp, a quiet man from rural Hesse, whose large, practical hands seemed to physically crave the familiar sensation of working the soil. They had been captured in the chaos of Normandy. Now they were in England. The train halted near a cold, flat expanse. "Priest Heath," barked Sergeant Major Alistair Davies, a man whose features were carved by years of routine discipline rather than battlefield fervour. "Camp 11, move it, lads." Klaus stepped onto the gravel path. The camp was not the brutal fortress of their propaganda. It was sprawling, functional, and deeply anticlimactic. Rows of corrugated iron Nissen huts were surrounded by 2 layers of barbed wire. The air carried the clean, bracing scent of wood smoke and distant, wet heather, an unsettlingly peaceful contrast to their internal turmoil. Klaus noted the guards were not vengeful, only bored, their duty a tedious necessity. Erich, however, saw confirmation of British cunning. He spat onto the gravel. "They will try to break us with their comfort, Klaus." A soft deception. They hide their hatred behind routine. "They are just tired, Erich," Klaus countered, feeling the fatigue of the guards reflected in his own soul. "They are men who would rather count us than shoot at us. Perhaps that is all they are." Within a week, the prisoners were deemed useful. The country was starved of agricultural labour. Klaus, Erich, and Sepp were bundled onto a lorry, driven past the sturdy, respectable brick homes of Whitchurch and deep into the heart of North Shropshire. The land was impossibly green, divided by ancient, knotted hawthorn hedgerows, promising a quiet, perpetual productivity that felt offensively calm. Their destination was Huxley Farm, near the quiet village of Wem. The farmer, Mr. Thomas Huxley, was a compact, sturdy man, whose back was permanently rounded from years spent stooping over furrows. He wore thick corduroys and a cap, embodying the immutable permanence of the English countryside. His appraisal of the men was purely professional. "You're for the roots," Thomas drawled, his Shropshire accent thick and earthy. "The sugar beet needs pulling." "We're behind schedule, so no loafing." The labour was a physical penance. Bent over in the cold, wet soil, they attacked the heavy, stubborn sugar beets. The sweet, earthy smell of the mud clung to them, a constant, sickening perfume. Klaus's medic hands were reduced to raw, blistered meat. Erich worked with a desperate, destructive energy, trying to sweat out his ideological rage. Sepp, however, moved with an intuitive grace. He recognized the language of the soil and responded with efficient, practiced strength, setting a relentless pace the farmer seemed to appreciate. On the second afternoon, the silence of their work was broken by the arrival of Mrs. Eleanor Hodgson, Thomas Huxley's wife. Solid and imposing in her floral apron, smelling faintly of warm baking, she emerged from the farmhouse, carrying a large, steaming, chipped teapot and a tray of thick, mismatched earthenware mugs. She set the tray down with a decisive clatter. "Tea, lads," she stated, her voice brooking no argument. "It'll warm the bones and settle the stomach." She looked directly down the line of dirty, broken German men. She didn't offer a smile, nor did she offer a glare. she offered an essential need. And I found a sliver of margarine for the bread. Can't waste good ration points. Erich, startled by the directness of her gaze, flinched and stiffly refused. I require nothing. Don't be daft, son, she replied, her tone shifting slightly to one of maternal, non-negotiable care. You're shivering. Drink the tea. She held the mug steady. Erich hesitated, his body's desperate need for warmth battling his ingrained instruction to reject enemy charity. The warmth of the mug, when he finally accepted it, was an immediate, physical comfort that bypassed politics entirely. He watched her retreat, noting the casual, complete absence of malice. Klaus realized then that they had expected the British to treat them as symbols. Instead, they were being treated as broken, cold human machines who needed fuel and maintenance. This practical, undramatic decency was the first significant breach in the emotional armor they had built. As November arrived, Sepp's connection to the land began to translate into subtle respect from the farmer. He noticed a mechanical flaw in an old seed drill. Without a word to Corporal Jenkins, Sepp effected a temporary repair with salvaged wire, allowing the afternoon's planting to continue. That evening, Thomas Huxley said nothing, but a new coil of proper wire and a decent pair of pliers appeared in the barn's tool shed. It was an unspoken contract, a demonstration of trust and professional recognition that transcended their prisoner status. The final wall was breached by the mundane reality of childhood. Thomas's 8-year-old son, George Huxley, was perpetually curious. One afternoon, George lost his small, cherished wooden soldier near the hedgerow. His distress was loud and pure. Sepp, walking his row of carrots, spotted the toy half buried in the clay. He picked it up and walked silently towards the boy. George looked up, startled by the towering German soldier. Sepp gently placed the painted piece of wood in George's small, shaking hand. George stopped crying instantly. He looked at the soldier, then up at Sepp, and whispered a shaky, clear, "Thank you, mister." Mrs. Hodgson, observing from the farmhouse, simply stood, a spectator to a moment where the soldier became merely a man returning a child's toy. The war, for a brief, essential second, disappeared completely. The greatest psychological test came when Thomas needed the men to accompany him into the village of Wem. The prospect of walking uncaged into the heart of the enemy community filled them with dread. As they walked down Wem's main street, past shops with ration queues and clothes flapping on lines, Klaus braced for the inevitable scorn, but the villagers merely glanced at the PW patches on their uniforms. A woman pulling a heavy shopping basket paused and simply offered a neutral nod. It was this utter lack of personal grudge that was most disarming. It implied that their existence, as enemies, simply wasn't important enough to disrupt the daily routine of survival. At the blacksmith's forge, Mr. Silas Thorne hammered noisily. As Thomas negotiated, Erich watched a spontaneous game of football in the cobbled street. When a ball, kicked too hard by a skinny boy named Peter, soared toward him, Erich instinctively caught it. He froze, expecting a guard's shout. Instead, Peter ran up. "Oi, mate, kick it back, will ya? We're losing the light." The boy treated him as an equal participant. Erich, guided by pure reflex, punted the ball back with a powerful, perfect strike. Peter caught it, his face splitting into a grin. "Good kick." "Cheers," he shouted back, completely oblivious to the historical irony. Erich was left shaken by the realization that a spontaneous act of skill was valued more than the uniform he wore. Finally, Thomas led them to the bakery of Mrs. Penelope Ainsworth. After buying the required stale penny buns, Thomas turned to leave. Mrs. Ainsworth, a woman with warm, steady eyes, handed the bag to Klaus. As she did, she subtly slipped a small, rare piece of ginger biscuit into the corner, out of Thomas's view. "A little something extra for their troubles," she murmured. An act of minor, personal subversion against the war's demands for austerity and hatred. It was a luxury of kindness. As they walked back to the truck, chewing the dry bread and tasting the fleeting sweetness of the contraband ginger, Klaus put words to the transformation. "They do not hold the grudge we expected," he whispered. "They do not see us as ideological symbols. They see men who are cold and hungry. They see the work that must be done. And that is all." Throughout the bitter Shropshire winter, the farm became a strange sanctuary. Mrs. Hodgson's consistent, pragmatic care, extra portions of thick, onion-infused stew, and mended holes in their work trousers maintained their strength. Klaus, committed to bridging the divide, diligently practiced his fragmented English with Mrs. Hodgson. She taught him the language of the farm: spud, turnip, lad. He taught her how to pronounce his son Gunther's name. One afternoon, Klaus finally showed her the worn photograph of his wife, Anneliese. Mrs. Hodgson took it, her expression softening into shared understanding. "She's a worried woman," Mrs. Hodgson observed, handing it back. "Just like me." She paused, her gaze settling on the distant hills. "Our Robert is fighting in Burma. Not a word from him since the summer. But the sun still rises here, doesn't it, Klaus? And someone still has to feed the chickens, regardless of which flag is flying." This was the profound, final lesson for Klaus. Their bond was rooted in universal fear and the relentless continuity of life. They were two parents from opposite sides of a bloody war, sharing the silent, consuming worry for a child. The war's grand narrative had been dwarfed by the simple, terrifying reality of a mother's love. Even Erich, the former zealot, could not resist the pressure of normalcy. When the farm tractor broke down one freezing morning, Erich, despite himself, used his mechanical expertise to diagnose and fix the engine. Corporal Jenkins, instead of reporting the enemy assistance, simply tossed Erich a half-packet of cheap, sweet English cigarettes. "Cheers, mate. You've got the touch." The exchange was not heroic, but profoundly human. Erich accepted the cigarettes, his rigid ideological walls finally crumbling under the weight of such mundane, non-political decency. When the war ended the following spring, Klaus felt a profound, aching conflict, relief for home, mixed with sorrow for leaving the quiet safety of this enemy place. As they were transported back, Sergeant Major Davies approached them. He didn't offer a final speech, only the gesture of a handshake to Klaus, a sign of respect previously unimaginable. "Safe journey home, Richter," Davies said. "Give your wife my best, and thank Mrs. Hodgson for the tea. We're glad to see you're still whole." As the lorry pulled away from Huxley Farm, Thomas Huxley stood by the kitchen door, his cap pulled low, watching them go. He raised a hand, briefly, a final, non-committal wave of a farmer, seeing off seasonal help who had done their job well. Klaus, Erich, and Sepp carried with them not the bitterness of defeat, but the quiet, lasting memory of the green fields of Shropshire and the casual, persistent, non-grudging kindness of ordinary people. Proof that humanity persisted even when war demanded hatred. They left as men who understood their former foes not as ideological enemies, but as neighbors, forever linked by a single, shared winter of labor and tea.